This lecture video is going to take you through the sociological debate of sociology and science. It will look at the arguments as to whether or not sociology is, could be, should be, is not a science. It will look at the arguments about what do we consider to be science. And by the end of it, you should be able to answer the essay question relating to sociology as a science, because the question tends to be a variation on a theme. It will ask you to evaluate the view that sociology can be a science, or sociology can't be a science, or it should be a science, or it shouldn't be a science. So the arguments that you're going to come across in this lecture will all apply to those questions. You just need to manipulate them a little in order to answer the demands of the question that is set. So the first thing we need to talk about is the key question. So we're first of all going to deal with the question of what do we mean by science? Because in order for sociology to be considered a science, we need to have a definition, a quantification of what we mean by science. Then we will go on to discuss whether or not sociology can, should be, should not be, is not a science as well. So what do we mean by science? Well, when we're talking about science in sociology, we tend to use what Karl Popper, who stated that good science is all about building scientific knowledge by gathering data from the senses, otherwise known as the hypothetico-deductive reasoning. So he is suggesting that we use deductive reasoning to find out about the world around us using our senses, what we see, what we hear, what we feel, what we taste, if you like. But science is building knowledge. And Popper points out that Popper identifies 5 components of science, 5 components of scientific knowledge. And in order for something to be scientific, it must meet this criteria. So what are these components? The first one he talks about is empiricism. And what he means by that is for something to be scientific, it has to be able to be counted and measured. So whatever it is you are looking at, in order for it to be considered a science, it must be countable, it must be measurable, it must be information that can be measured. Okay, so empiricism means being able to count or measure your information. He talks about testability, or something in science must be testable. So it needs to be knowledge, it needs to be conclusions, information that can be both tested and retested. It can be proven right, it can be proven wrong by testing. Okay. Thirdly, he talks about it needs to be theoretical. And what he means by this is it needs to seek a causal relationship and doesn't simply describe or to explain. It's about creating rules, if you like, a causal relationship between 2 variables to say this causes that. So what we sometimes refer to also as causality. Rather than simply describing what's happening, we need to explain what is happening. He also talks about it being cumulative, so it's building on previous knowledge. They're not trying to just come up with something out of thin air. It's using what other people have already done to build upon it, to grow our knowledge. Not just create new knowledge, but to grow knowledge. And finally, he talks about objectivity and being objective. He states that personal feelings and prejudices, etc., have no place in science. Science should be unbiased. It should not be influenced by your personal values, your personal beliefs, or your unconscious biases that you perhaps don't even know you hold. It needs to be objective. It needs to stay separate from the researcher. So in order for something to be scientific, it must meet this criteria. Now, when it comes to sociology as a science, there are various arguments, And the first one comes from the positivists, and you'll probably remember this from the interpretivism versus positivism debate. But the interpretivists state very clearly that sociology can and should be considered a science. It meets the criteria set out by Popper to be considered a science. And the reasoning for it is that they believe that society is patterned, that there are patterns of behaviour, there are patterns of decision making, there are patterns within society. It's not chaotic. It might be considered organised chaos, but there's still patterns there. There's still a what's the word I'm looking for? Not pattern. I can't think of it anyway. But there's a pattern to society, and that reality exists independently of the mind and therefore can be studied objectively. They also talk about factual knowledge, and that the fact that there are patterns in society means that you can create social facts, and social facts are the rules which make up society, which are separate and independent from individuals. So when you observe a pattern within society, you can create a causal relationship. You can create a social fact which can be proven or disproven. It can be tested. Okay. He then says that because we have social facts, they can be verified using inductive logic, meaning that we can collect data and form a conclusion. Social facts can be tested, they can be verified. Therefore, and when they are verified, they become truth. So therefore, sociology can and is a science. Durkheim then went on to prove his point that sociology could be a science by studying suicide. And he looked at suicide because it was seen as a very personal, non-societal issue that didn't have any rules or regulations. So there wasn't really any rules to suicide. And Durkheim wanted to show through the study of sociology that sociology was a science because there are rules to be uncovered. There are patterns to the chaotic, if you like, that can reveal patterns in suicide. So what he did was he used official statistics to see what was happening, and he looked at various societies within Europe. Now bear in mind this is the 1800s, and what he said was that based on the functionalist theory of the society, that society is made up of both regulation and integration, and you need a balance between the two to have a healthy society. When there is imbalance, that is when social problems occur, and that's when suicide occurs. So what he said was that when there is an imbalance between integration and regulation, it creates different types of suicide. So when you have too much regulation, you get what he calls fatalistic suicide, when you feel like there is nothing within your control, everything is controlled for you, so you take the control that you can have, which is to commit suicide. If you have too little regulation, you get anomic suicide, and this is where you feel completely overwhelmed because you don't know where you sit in society. You don't know how to behave, the expectations, the rules, the regulations, and it can become overwhelming. With integration, you get too little integration, he referred to as egoistic suicide, and this is where people feel marginalized by society. They don't feel part of society. They're either above it or they're on the outsides of it. Too much integration is what he referred to as altruistic suicide, where you take the weight of the problems of society on your shoulders and you feel that you need to manage and solve those social problems. But what Durkheim did here was he took something that was considered chaotic and without rules and created social rules, social facts that could be tested and verified. and therefore showing that sociology was a science. Now, there were some problems with this study, in particular the fact that he was using coroner's reports to determine the official statistics of suicide. And obviously in the 1800s and 1900s, when Durkheim was completing this study, it was quite a religious society, and particularly the rich and powerful and the ruling class could pay the coroner to not put suicide down as the cause of death, because it would give embarrassment and scandal to the family, and would mean that the person who had died would not be able to be buried in the family plot, because suicides can't be buried on hallowed ground. But it shows that even what Durkheim tried to do, and did do to a certain extent, was show that sociology could and should be a science, because it does meet that criteria set by Popper as to the 5 components of science. At the other end of the spectrum, we have interpretivism, and they argue very clearly that sociology cannot and should not even try to be a science. And they point out that it's not possible, because unlike the natural sciences, who are using cells or chemicals to do their research, sociologists are using people, and people are conscious beings. So there's far more ethical considerations with regards to experimenting and studying humans than there are with chemicals and with cells. It's also pointed out that with chemicals and things like that in the natural sciences, you can control all of the variables. You mix chemical A with chemical B, you get reaction C. Now with humans, with people, you can't control all the variables. You can't control if somebody's having a bad day, that they've got up in the morning, they've spilt their tea or their coffee down their front, had an argument with their loved ones, they missed the bus, and just generally had a really crappy day. And that could influence how they react to your study. Or it might be that they have a really good day, and the sun's shining, and they feel good, and they've been with their friends, they had a nice iced tea or iced coffee or something, and they're feeling in a really good mood. Those things will influence how people react to your study. So comparing the natural sciences, where there aren't those sort of variables, to the sociology, where you have to take those variables into account, means to the interpretivist that sociology cannot be a science. It is impossible to control all the variables. They also state that sociology is about meanings, not the what, but the why. So you're looking at the unobservable. So by watching somebody's behaviour, you cannot determine why they behave that way. You've got to ask them, why did you do that? And some of the times we do things that we don't know why we do them. We just do. So with the qualitative data that the interpretivists prefer, because it gives more detailed, in-depth why, the reasoning behind behaviour, the meaning behind the behaviour, means that sociology cannot be a science, because it is unobservable. And they also talk about the impossibility of causality. Okay, with so many extraneous variables, it is impossible to state X causes Y. It can have an influence, which means that you can create correlation, but you cannot definitively say that lack of integration leads to egoistic suicide. It's impossible. You cannot say that lack of education in schools leads to teen pregnancy. It's a factor, but if that was the cause of teen pregnancy, is the lack of sex education in schools, then all teenagers would be getting pregnant, and they don't. So can't be the only cause. Okay, so there's an inability to create causality when looking at people and when looking at society. You can create correlations, you can show patterns between behaviours, but you can't say X causes Y. So therefore, sociology cannot and should not be considered as science. It is not observable. It is the consciousness of your participants leads to extraneous variables, which leads to a lack of causality. There will always be, not everybody does this. Okay, so we can't be definitive in our findings. We can say, well, there's a relationship here, positive, negative, whatever, but we cannot say that one thing causes another on its own, in its entirety. Next, we look at the middle ground. So these are the arguments that say that sociology currently isn't a science, but it has the possibility to be a science. So it's not there yet, but it has the potential to become a science. And the first argument to bring this up is Popper himself, where he talks about falsification. And he says, at present, sociology is not falsifiable, but if it can become falsifiable, it could become a science. So what does he mean by that, falsifiable? So in order for something to be a science, it must be falsifiable. And that doesn't mean that you prove it wrong, just that it is open to being proven wrong. That you have a theory, a conclusion, whatever, that can both be verified, so retested and proven right, or it can be falsified, retested and proven wrong. It's open, so it's open to being proven right or wrong, not just accepted as truth. And to illustrate that, he talks about the swan analogy. And with the swan analogy, he says that if you sit by a river and watch the swans swim past and you only see white swans, it's logical to conclude that swans are white, that all swans are white. You've never seen anything but a white swan. However, that conclusion of all swans are white is both verifiable and falsifiable, because you could also sit by a river and watch the swans go past and see just white swans going past, and you can conclude, yep, Popper's right, swans are white. However, there's the possibility of a black swan going past. And if a black swan goes past, then Popper's conclusion that all swans are white has been falsified. Okay, so he's not saying that in order for something to be a science, it must be proven wrong. It's saying it has the potential to be proven wrong. It's open to being proven wrong. Okay, and that links in with that idea of cumulative knowledge, because, for example, when we first start talking about astronomy, get it right, it was initially believed that the Earth rotates, the sun rotates around the Earth and the heavens and all the rest of it. And that is falsifiable because we have falsified it. We have shown that that's not the case. It's the Earth that rotates around the sun and so on and so forth. So proving that, but that's building on the prior knowledge that we had. We've not just turned around and gone, no, it's wrong. We've actually built on that knowledge. Go, well, this bit is right, but there's also this. So we can say with the swan analogy that yes, swans are white, but there's also black ones and grey ones. And I guess you could get other colours if you dyed them, but that would be animal cruelty. But so it's that idea that you can have a theory, a conclusion that is both verifiable, so proven, retested and proven true, or falsifiable, it can be retested and eventually proven wrong. Now, what Popper said was sociology currently doesn't have that. the theories within sociology cannot be verified and they can't be falsified. Functionalism can't be verified, it can't be falsified. You can't say, well, I can prove that there's social cohesion and the integration of social institutions and things like that, and you can't prove it wrong. Same with feminism. Yes, there is empirical evidence of patriarchy, but we cannot prove, we cannot falsify the general theory. We cannot falsify or verify many of the theories within sociology. So therefore, currently, sociological thinking is not scientific. Popper also talks about deductive reasoning. So if you remember, he talks about the hypothetico-deductive model, and what he suggests is that in order for something to be a science, you have to create a hypothesis that is able to be proven right or wrong. And again, sociology can't do this. You can't, functionalism, Marxism, interactionism, all of these theories are not hypotheses that can be proven right or wrong. They're theories. And often with sociological research, it's more a inductive reasoning, where we want to see what's happening and come to a conclusion, rather than saying, well, this is what I think is going to happen, and then either prove it right or wrong. So there are elements of sociology that are scientific, according to Popper, those that can be verified and those that are open to falsification. But the vast majority of sociology is still unscientific due to it not being able to be verified or falsified. The next theory comes from Kuhn and talks about paradigms. And again, this theory says that sociology currently is not scientific, but it has the potential to be scientific. And what Kuhn talks about is this idea of in order for something to be scientific, it has to have a single paradigm. And a paradigm is a set of guidelines which everyone who is conducting research in that area follows. So almost like a set of guidelines, a set of rules that everybody agrees on. And sociology doesn't have that. None of the theories actually agree. And even within those theories, there's still disagreement. In functionalism, you've got Merton's ideas of dysfunction. In feminism, you've got multiple theories of feminism which agree on certain things but not on others. Marxism and neo-Marxism. So late modernism and postmodernism. So there's lots of different paradigms. And when it comes to sociological research, you've got the positivist approach and you've got the interpretivist approach, both of which give you a different set of guidelines as to how you should conduct your research and how you should conduct your studies. So therefore, sociology cannot be a science. He also talks about scientific revolution. And this is the idea, and this builds on that idea again of cumulative knowledge, where you can have a single paradigm, but as you learn more and as you gain more knowledge and more information, it can lead to a scientific revolution. And what he means by this is it creates a new paradigm. So the more anomalies that occur force the paradigm to be questioned, which then create new paradigms. Again, we can go back to our idea of the Earth, the sun rotating around the Earth, which, as more information came out, as we learned more about astronomy, not astrology, astronomy, we could see that this wasn't the case, and it caused a scientific revolution where we moved away from the belief that the sun rotates around the Earth to the Earth rotating around the sun, and a new paradigm was formed. So essentially what Kuhn is saying is that sociology is pre-paradigmic. We are still in that process of creating a paradigm, and as soon as sociologists have a single paradigm, they can be considered scientific. Okay, So sociology is pre-scientific, it is pre-paradigmic, but it has the potential to become scientific. Now, the postmodernists don't like this idea. The postmodernists don't like the idea of single paradigms in sociology. They link it too much to a meta-narrative and the idea of trying to create an absolute truth. And in sociology, that's undesirable. We don't want absolute truths. We don't want universal laws of society. We want to explore the diversity of society and the diversity within society. So therefore, this idea of becoming scientific is not really what the postmodernists are interested in. The final argument of sociology could be a science comes from Keat and Urry, and this is the realist approach. And they argue that sociology could be a science, it just depends on what your definition of science is. If you are using the closed system definition, which is the one put forward by Popper, sociology is not a science, because not all variables can be controlled, because not everything is observable, and there's various elements of sociology that just mean that sociology cannot be considered a science. If you're using that 5 criteria that Popper put forward, and if you're using that closed system definition. So, for example, biology is a science under the closed system because you can control all your variables. You have empiricism, you can observe, you can record what's happening. Same with chemistry. You mix chemical A with chemical B, you get reaction C. All variables can be controlled. You can control the temperature of the chemical, you can control the heat, the amount of chemical. With sociology, you are not able to do that. There are too many extraneous variables. So therefore, under the closed system definition, sociology is not science. However, if you use the open systems definition, which accepts that not all variables can be controlled, then sociology can be a science. And what Keat and Urry use as an example is meteorology, so the study of the weather. This is considered a scientific discipline, but you can't control the weather. We know this. We've had the beast from the east. We've had days where it said, oh, it's going to be gorgeous sunshine, and then it's torrential rain. We've had storms that have appeared out of nowhere, or essentially out of nowhere, or storms that have not done what the data suggests that it was going to do. It said it was going to turn west, it went east. We saw that with Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Katrina. Both of those, with the data suggested that they would head back out to sea. They didn't. They hit land and were major natural disasters. But within meteorology, within astronomy, there are variables that can't be controlled. And in both of these examples, the scientists say, because we don't know enough. That is why they still consider it a science, but we can't control all the variables. And therefore, under that definition, sociology could be considered a science. Because we accept that there are variables we can't control. We can't control a person's day. We can't control their mental health or things like that. There is still a lot about the human mind and the brain and the human body that we just don't understand in terms of genetics. So under the open system, sociology could be a science if we just accept that within science, not all variables can be controlled. So, the debate on can and should sociology be a science, we have the no perspective at one end of the spectrum, the positivist, the yes perspective at one end of the spectrum, which says sociology can and should be a science from the positivists. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the interpretivists, who say that sociology cannot, should not, and shouldn't even try to be a science. And then in the middle, we've got those the falsification, the paradigms, and open and closed system definitions, which suggest that sociology could be a science. It doesn't say whether or not it should be, though.